today's Snack and Learn webinar. My name's Jenny Merriman. I work for WSP based in the UK. I sit within our Earth and Environment discipline and lead our work on natural capital and biodiversity. So I'm very pleased to be talking to you for the next 20 minutes about the changing role of rural land and a couple of projects that we've been working on recently with clients thinking about their land and deriving different types of value from it. The handout is available, so the slides are available in the handouts section that you'll see on your GoToWebinar panel. And we've also got a questions box for you. So if you have questions coming up throughout the presentation, then please do pop them in the box and our moderator will read those out as part of a Q&A session at the end. So I want to start off just giving a little bit of context in relation to the transition to a sustainable future, and then think about this particularly in relation to what this means for rural land, drawing on the UK from our experience of some work that we've been doing here. And I'll present 3 short case studies to talk through what we've been doing with clients and some of the challenges and innovations and key takeaways from those pieces of work before we have an opportunity for a Q&A session. So we're all aware of the scale of the challenge we're facing in order to transition to a sustainable future. Planetary boundaries model shown here reflects how sustainably we're living on the planet. Where we want to be is within that green donut, which represents a safe operating space. So how we're using our resources and the impact that we're having on the planet should be sitting within that circle. And you can see that we're overshooting on 4 of the 9 environmental limits in relation to climate change, biodiversity loss, land conversion and pollution. And that we're also delivering shortfalls in terms of a societal foundation, so delivering the fundamental human rights and well-being that globally we should be providing for everybody. So the Sustainable Development Goals are a way to measure how well we are developing sustainably this decade. They were came about in 2015 and will be reported on in 2030. And this diagram here shows the fundamental role of the biosphere, the 4 goals related to our planet and atmosphere that underpin the potential to deliver on the remaining goals around society and economy. So we cannot transition to a sustainable future without investing in and rebuilding our nature, our natural capital. So the biodiversity crisis and tackling our food system are both absolutely key to address alongside the climate challenge. Unabated climate change could cost the world at least 5% of GDP each year, potentially up to 20% if more drastic climate warming happens. And at the same time, there's been an estimated value at risk of 4 trillion from the loss of nature that's happening in tandem with climate change. And we know that around 86% of our critically endangered species globally are endangered due to the driver of agriculture and land conversion. But at the same time, a transition to a green economy, to a sustainable future, comes with huge opportunities. Financially, looking at potential value of markets for low carbon technologies at the level of 500 billion by 2050, the creation of nearly 400 million green jobs by transitioning to an H-positive future by 2030, and also a market for carbon sequestration on farms, potentially to the tune of £1.25 billion by 2050. So some really clear environmental, financial and societal benefits from developing more sustainably. So what does this context then mean for rural land? Well, here in the UK, we have had some quite a lot of reports released, particularly this one from the Climate Change Committee, which is thinking about how our land needs to transition in order to meet a net zero future and restore an equitable climate. In the UK, agriculture makes up nearly 70% of our total land area in England. And so taking 4.6 million hectares of this out of agricultural production to meet net zero targets would require a shift of about 25% of our total land area to different use. So it's a considerable transition that's being talked about here. Target interventions include woodland, growing crops for energy, for bioenergy, agroforestry, and rewetting our peatlands as a key carbon store and at the moment carbon source to the atmosphere. We're seeing considerable increase in land value in the rural economy. So in the year running up to 2020, commercial forestry increased in value by 60%, which was huge. Generally, land prices have increased by more than 5% in the run-up to September 2021. And at the same time, the cost of agriculture has gone up tremendously, so a 22% increase in agricultural input inflation last year. So all of this is leading farmers and landowners to seek out how they can best manage their businesses to make them viable based on these evolving markets, land use diversification, and a surge of emerging environmental schemes and funding, both from public funding, but also coming in from the private sector as well. As an example, research shows that the market for carbon credits globally could be worth $50 billion by 2030. And here in England, we're developing a market for biodiversity through the mandatory requirement for biodiversity net gain under the Agriculture Act from 2021. So this act requires developers to deliver a minimum of 10% gain in biodiversity after development compared to before. So through that, there's likely to be a requirement for off-site offsets, and there's an opportunity for land to become an offset for providing that increase in biodiversity. And we estimate that 10 hectares of current arable land would be worth 1 million in biodiversity units, £1 million over 30 years. And that's probably double what it would be worth if you were growing wheat over the same period. So what we're seeing is a change in the way land is viewed and who is interested in owning land. So these clippings here show the immense increase in take-up of land ownership from across different sectors: individuals, philanthropists, corporates, civil society, all of whom are seeing opportunities that land can deliver a wider range of benefits, a wider range of environmental, social, and also financial returns. So this is really a new way of thinking about land and value, which is being driven by these markets and also by policy change. So with this backdrop, we've been doing some work with a large landowner in England to look at setting a new strategic vision for their rural land portfolio, and essentially coming up with a new rural strategy that reflects the markets, the drivers, but also looks to deliver the best value. So we took an integrated approach to addressing value, not just focused on financial returns, but thinking about how the environmental values could be maximised and how social value could also be delivered from changing the way that land was managed and what was done with that land. We worked across different disciplines, so our team involved people from rural planning, from economics advisory, from socioeconomics, sustainability and climate change, biodiversity net gain experts, and our natural capital team. The work had a couple of challenges, two that I've drawn upon here. The first one relates to the scope of work. So this was developing a strategy. So as part of that, there's obviously a need for extensive discussion, for a lot of evolution of ideas, and exchange and engagement with the client, with us, and also with other stakeholders and other consultants as well. It was a new concept, thinking about land not just for farming, but for the other benefits that it might provide. I think, so timber and forestry is one that has been going back for many years, but thinking about land being able to provide an income from something like rewilding is a new idea, and obviously less known by landowners and people that manage land in general. So there was lots of uncertainties and a need to really think through what the opportunities might be, what the risks might be, and explain the concept and provide some sort of trust that this was a potentially viable option. So we had to take a very adaptive and flexible approach to working through this project to get the right outcome for the client. The second main challenge was around sort of data and evidence. So the first point here is in relation to finding robust, quantifiable data for societal benefits. So this piece of work was very high level. We were thinking strategically rather than focusing down on any particular locations. And as a result, it was quite challenging to find any credible social metrics that we could use to actually pull out numbers for some of the benefits that might come from different ways of using land. So instead, we took a qualitative approach to looking at societal benefits using a RAG score, red, amber, green, to look at how different interventions might deliver against things like jobs, local community cohesion, health and well-being. We also had to make sure that the metrics we were using were comparing like for like. So in looking at future scenarios, we were looking at natural capital analysis and economic valuation of environmental values, and had to make sure that when we were looking at the baseline condition of what the land is currently providing, we were using the same measures and comparing like for like. So not necessarily thinking about land prices, but thinking about how much agricultural production in terms of yield that land was producing, or how much flood risk it was actually reducing. And the final sort of challenge was around the uncertainty in terms of key markets that we were looking at. So predominantly focused on thinking about the biodiversity offsetting market that is coming through the mandatory net gain requirement in England's policy, but also the carbon market and the volatility around carbon pricing. So we had to take a conservative approach to both the quantitative valuation of carbon and of biodiversity units that might be delivered over a long period of time, but then also the economic value that we were applying over a 30-year period where obviously there's quite a lot of uncertainty and unknowns. So the way in which we went about this work was to essentially review the backdrop of trending land use interventions, the drivers behind that, both in terms of rural societal change, but also the environmental drivers of nature positive and climate change, and how that's being incorporated into policies influencing land in the UK. We came up with around 12 different interventions, so different alternative uses for land, and applied a filter that looked at how each of these would deliver against a number of specific criteria under financial returns, environmental benefits, and social benefits. And so we filtered this down to 8 different options and blended those into 2 future scenarios, one which was very much focused around still delivering agricultural output, so regenerative farming model with mainly tenanted land as it is now. And the second looking much more at a fundamental shift away from farming for food towards looking at changing land for the purpose of biodiversity gain and carbon lockup. We valued both of these different scenarios using our integrated valuation model, which drew on biophysical and economic values for environmental benefits and also market values from producing different things from the land, and assessed the overall value, disaggregating it into actual financial value, so where money could actually be made and income could be made, and also more the economic environmental values, so those benefits at the moment that don't have markets but possibly might in the future. So things like air quality and flood risk reduction. So this project, we found that there were clearly financially viable opportunities to diversifying land use, and really quite attractive shift in terms of looking at different ways to make money and to also at the same time deliver much better diversity of value from the land. And implementing nature-based solutions was a sort of key driver behind this. But it was also necessary to think carefully about the practicality, so that comes with a number of trade-offs, and also considerable risks and opportunities to think through in terms of how willing a landowner or an organisation or a company might be to take on these uncertainties and shift to a completely new business model. Also, it was important to think about local context, as I mentioned with the social metrics. Because we didn't have local context, we were looking strategically. It was quite hard to actually drill down into what some of the changes might mean locally. So it would be important to definitely take another level of looking at this by looking at the estate level or by looking at particular regional trends to think about the actual outcomes that might come from any particular change in land management. The second project was in Scotland. Similarly, we were working with a landowning client to look at their land management on their estate and aligning this with their corporate sustainability strategy, particularly focused on themes of protecting nature and achieving net zero. So for this last year, we undertook a baseline biodiversity assessment of all of their estates and also a baseline carbon assessment across their estates for all of the habitats that were present. And we used this to develop with the client a new vision for land at 2 of these particular estates in terms of how they could deliver biodiversity enhancements and improved carbon lockup in their soils and in habitats. The main challenge here was with the initial piece of work. The different estates came from very different contexts. Some were built up urban sites, which lended themselves less to showing significant or substantial uplift in terms of biodiversity or carbon. So we then drilled down to focusing on 2 particular sites where there was much more available land to think about transitioning, so agricultural land, grassland and woodlands. We used an adapted version of the biodiversity metric, which has been developed by Natural England here in the UK to assess the biodiversity units on each estate and to map those. We also used an in-house carbon tool, which looks at carbon stock and flux in different habitats and mapped that as well. And the map on this diagram is showing the carbon across one of the estates. We then considered the 2 benefits together, looking at where there were opportunities to increase both biodiversity and also carbon lockup by changing how the land was managed or by changing the actual land use in different places. This project showed us that nature-based solutions as a way of thinking about land provided a significant opportunity to exchange knowledge and to understand the client and for the client to understand new opportunities that come with thinking in a more holistic way about land and how it delivers a number of different benefits. We also found that the project shifted preconceptions about what the outcome might be. So initially, the driver was thinking about carbon offsetting in terms of a net zero roadmap, but actually we found that the more significant opportunity here was around biodiversity enhancement and looking at the health of soil and using carbon as more of a co-benefit. The final example, just to talk through, is some work undertaken by our planning team, and this was very much focused around looking at regeneration for local society. So the South Ormsby estate is in Lincolnshire in England, it's 3,000 acres, and they really wanted to look at developing a new vision and strategy to address issues of deprivation, it's in a particular area of deprived housing and services. So WSP prepared a whole estate plan that articulated an approach to change that could benefit the local society, the environment and economy by focusing on developing a better social infrastructure and better local rural economy. And this was done through considerable stakeholder engagement. The particular challenges were around the highly sensitive context of the area in relation to the environment, but also its cultural heritage and sense of place that people had. So needing to bring all of those together and very much have it as a grassroots generated vision was an important component of this work. The second challenge was thinking through the financial shift that might have to be undertaken to rely less on current sources of financial income and move towards some of these new emerging markets and thinking about public funding, which hasn't been a main feature until now. So the approach was very much looking at how to enhance the social fabric of the estate through delivering a natural capital approach, but with a primary focus of developing skills, opportunities through improved stewardship of the land. So this project demonstrated the importance when thinking about nature-based solutions, not just thinking about the environment, but thinking about the fundamental role of local people as an essential component of change and how it's necessary to engage and build up from the grassroots when you're thinking about change to local economies or to changing the way that jobs might be delivered. The future of the estate changed, in this case, from being a single person's vision to a story of a whole community who've now invested in and have pride in their local biodiversity and landscape. And it also highlighted the financial risks that might need to be taken by landowners with the uncertainty around changes to funding and also looking at more publicly funded schemes. So I hope that's been an interesting overview of our experience of the changing role of rural land, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you, Jenny, for your presentation. So before moving into the Q&A period, I would like to remind attendees to enter your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar platform. And also you can download the PDF version of this presentation from the handout box on the GoToWebinar panel. I will start with the first question. Could carbon and biodiversity offsets have a negative impact on people locally, for example, by restricting their use of land?
Yes, if not done right. I think that's why it's important not to think about one single objective, but to think about the wider sustainable development opportunities and local needs, including thinking about societal opportunities as well. So yeah, biodiversity offsetting, carbon offsetting is also an opportunity to make places better for people, to provide opportunities for environmental education, health, recreation, tourism, and so on. In the UK, we have something called best practice principles for the biodiversity offsetting market, and they really reflect the need to deliver wider benefits to think about this as an issue. And there's also a document called Social Principles for Biodiversity Net Gain, which reflect on particularly this issue about the need to also think about changes and impacts on people. So yeah, I think provided that best practice guidance is followed, then that issue should be minimised.
Thank you. Is planting more trees the answer to our climate crisis?
No, reducing our emissions is. I think that's got to come first and foremost. However, planting trees is a necessary component of addressing the residual emissions that organisations, companies, nations may not be able to meet. And that needs to be done now, because obviously it takes some time for those trees to grow and to start sequestering carbon sort of to their maximum potential. So yes, it does need to be done, but it's not the answer. There's also other habitats that of course are critical, and our soils as well. So yeah, it's certainly not a sort of one solution.
Thank you. What are the key areas to focus on? For example, what elements should be prioritized to best aid the delivery of multiple benefits? Is it habitats or ecosystem services?
So I think it very much depends on the local context in terms of what the needs are, what the issues are locally. But as a principle, I think that restoring our key natural assets of soil health, water provision, and biodiversity are a good place to start. They all support ecosystem function, and that provides us with the benefits that we get from the environment, and we'll do so in a sustainable way. So I think if you focused on those three aspects and got that right, then everything else would probably flow from that.
Thank you. Are there financial incentives for farmers to get involved with these schemes?
Yes. So in the UK and certainly in England, the main opportunity that's coming is actually from our exit from the EU, and coming out of the Common Agricultural Policy, we're developing our own policy around agriculture and land use, called the Environmental Land Management Scheme. And through that, there's a transition to very much looking at public money for public goods, so paying landowners for delivering things like biodiversity enhancement or cultural heritage benefits or air quality improvements or flood risk reduction. That isn't live at the moment. The pilots are underway, but that will be coming in the near future. Habitat banking is the other major opportunity in England. In a year or so's time, the mandatory requirement for net gain from development will come in, and there will be a significant demand for offsite, offset land in order to make up for that net gain. And so a market will be set up and sort of regulated through a habitat bank set up by the government, that will enable landowners to essentially sell their land to developers who need to demonstrate a net gain, and that land can then be set aside for a minimum of 30 years to deliver on that biodiversity improvement. At the moment, there's other voluntary markets that are underway, so it is possible right now to particularly look at carbon and trading carbon through the Woodland Carbon Code or the Peatland Carbon Code, for example.
Thank you. Were the benefits of soil carbon sequestration, or healthy soils considered as a land component in any of the case studies?
Not directly, no, but the main one where we are going to be looking at soil is the Scotland example, and we're going to be doing hopefully some more sort of soil analysis to understand what the condition of the soil is at the moment under the land use they've currently got, which is partially sort of farmland, but also some grazed grassland, and to look at how we can actually monitor and measure changes in soil health, particularly soil carbon, to look at better storage of carbon.
Thank you. I will take the last question. Has any consideration been given to the risk that we are offshoring food production, or food production being obviously necessary, but the impacts being left in other countries?
So I think the question is around sort of leakage there, perhaps. Yes, I'm sure it's being considered in certainly in terms of when we're talking about looking at climate change and greenhouse gases, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, certainly thinking about value chains, supply chains, and where our products are coming from and what their impact is at those source locations. Very much so, that's going to be coming through also thinking about nature and nature positive. So the task force for nature related financial disclosures, will be very much thinking about that whole life cycle of where is that risk in relation to nature? Is it your direct operations, or does it come from where your products come from? So yeah, I think the same applies to food and food production. We need to be thinking carefully about producing food in the right way in this country, but also making sure that we know how our food is produced that we're importing from elsewhere, and having an appropriate principle and sort of threshold which we're sort of willing to accept there as well.
Fantastic, thank you. So we're at the end of our webinar session. Please feel free to follow up directly with Jenny via the contact details shown on the screen. And I would like to thank all attendees for joining today. Thank you for your time, and thank you, Jenny, for a fantastic presentation.
Pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.